much of the modern world, schools and schooling are today considered as necessary to human growth as air is to life. And yet there are a growing number of families in Massachusetts and across the country who, for many reasons, have decided to opt out of schools and instead homeschool. What are their motivations? What are their days like? What seem to be the prospects for homeschooled children as they enter adulthood? Helping me explore these questions is Pat Farenga, a homeschooling expert with some 34 years of personal and professional experience in the field. He was the publisher of Growing Without Schooling magazine, the nation's first periodical about learning outside school walls, from 1985 up to its last issue in 2001. Pat is a frequent source on the subject to media and at education conferences around the world. He has written 4 books about homeschooling, including most recently, How to Report Unschooling to School Officials. Welcome to Wide Angle, Pat.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks for
nice to be here.
Yeah. Well, I figured as good a place as any to start is to sort of take on what might be the myths that surround homeschooling. Yeah. And I think the biggest, the most persistent to start with maybe is the notion of socialization. Yeah. If viewers maybe have in mind a parent and children gathered around a kitchen table doing work, school at home, then it would maybe be natural to think that the homeschooled kids aren't being given sufficient opportunities to interact with other children, to collaborate, to encounter challenges and maybe negotiate those out. So is it your experience that, that those are legitimate worries for homeschoolers by and large?
Well, I would say they're not legitimate worries for homeschoolers over time, but I think initially they are because the culture perpetuates this. I've spoken to educators recently who brought that up as their first objection, and concern. No longer is there an objection that we don't have the right to homeschool. There's concerns. Like, parents aren't qualified, kids won't be socialized. But the irony is, the socialization that's taking place in school is actually increasing the number of homeschoolers as bullying and the pressure to compete against your classmates to get the rewards of school at the expense of those who don't, is creating an awful lot of tension for a lot of families and children. And so, ironically, that is one of the things that's been fueling the growth of homeschooling, is the fact that schools are no longer, if they ever were, places of socialization. I mean, yeah, it's true that people, the idea behind socialization, I think, at least as it's portrayed in the myths of school, is that people from different cultures and backgrounds will all be mixed in these classrooms and perpetuate a better democracy as a result of this. And on the face of it, it makes sense. But then the problem is, they're not really socializing. If you talk in school, you get punished. If you try to communicate with another student during the class, you get punished. And now they've cut back so much in the time that you can socialize. Very few schools have recess anymore. Because academic time has become so important. So, where does this socialization take place? The whole idea of socialization is not just, the result of schooling. I mean, what we realize is that I think that what we can realize is that people have been socialized without schools for centuries. People were socialized by society, by their culture, by their interactions with their elders and the youngers and people from different countries. I mean, that's how it happens, But to force it, and now, as we've done for over 150 years. I mean, compulsory schooling has only been around since 1850. Massachusetts was the first state to do this, and Prussia was the first country to do it, But that's only in the 19th century. And yet we act as if it's been here since the Stone Age. So socialization, I think, is one of those things that, just like parenting, like schools have assumed in loco parentis, they've assumed the role of parent, they've assumed the role of the socializer, they've assumed the role of the people who create democracy. I mean, I think our founding fathers would be shocked to think that schools were necessary for democracy.
Well, and certainly in doing a little bit of research to prepare for today, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, famous homeschoolers. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry.
Yeah, and then none of this is to say that there's no place for school-like places where people come willingly to learn things and join together to accomplish things.
Yeah.
You know, but the idea that you must be compelled to do it and that there's sort of a science behind it.
Right.
You know, that's the thing that not only do I challenge, but many people have challenged through the years.
I think common to parents whose children are in school, even if the parents are somewhat interested in the idea of homeschooling and the possibility of it, many still harbor the belief that they couldn't possibly homeschool their own kids.
Right.
You know, maybe it's because they don't have the patience. Maybe it's because they don't have enough knowledge to teach their kids all that the kids will need to know. And certainly those can go on and on. We could add more examples, but certainly in your experience working with parents who are new to homeschooling, yeah, you help people transition. Do you find those concerns warranted?
Oh yeah, those are all legitimate concerns. In fact, I would be concerned if a parent were going to homeschool without any concerns, you know? I mean, you should be concerned if you're sending your kid to school, right? You would go check out that school and the teachers and stuff. So yeah, you should investigate these things. And homeschooling's not for everybody, you know, just like I would insist school's not for everybody, you know, and I would also say that this can change over time. You know, different ages, different opinions change, and that's okay. There's a lot of concerns that parents have that are justified, but when they investigate homeschooling, they can, you know, particularly if they talk, and this is what I always advise: talk and read about talk to homeschoolers people who are actually doing it now. Read about those who, you know, what's going on. There's a lot of resources online as well as elsewhere. And then, you know, make your decision, you know. And it's not an irrevocable decision, you know. My youngest daughter, Audrey, she went to public schools in 3rd grade. She insisted that she, let me get this right. She went to 1st grade.
She won it right.
Yeah, it lasted 2 weeks, said, I want to come home. And then in 3rd grade, she wanted to go back. She lasted 6 weeks and wanted to come home, and she came home. And then in 8th grade, she decided that she wanted to homeschool through high school, but financially we couldn't make that happen. It was both Day and my wife and I both had to work then, so she went to high school. You know, but there was no problem going in and out of the school. You know, people think it's, oh, you're either in or you're out. You know, and that's true for the finances and stuff, but for your family. You can move in and out. Sure. You know, just like you can move from, you know, Arlington, Massachusetts to Arlington, Virginia, and they're going to have to take your kid in Arlington, Virginia, no matter when you move, in the middle of the school year or whatever. Sure. You know? So people get, you know, once you investigate these things, I think some of the fear will go away. But then the big fear that you mentioned is that, you know, and it's a good one to talk about, is parents don't feel qualified to teach their children. In fact, this was one of the things that, there was a recent article that is very hard to find. I've not found the actual interview with the head of the Department of Education under Obama, but he recently made a comment. We're concerned that parents aren't qualified to teach, you know, and to me that shows a real misunderstanding of how teaching and learning and homeschooling works, because if you think that the teacher gives the knowledge to the child, then you're wrong. Because the child learns from the teacher, or learns from the world around them, learns from the book, learns from the television show. You know, they learn from what's around them. How many of us have sat through algebra and Spanish and all these other classes and passed the tests, but we can't do algebra, we can't do Spanish, we don't care. You know, as soon as the test is over, we forget that. But we remember the stuff that's important to us and that we use. You know, we may come back, and now as an older man, it's like, gee, I wish I spoke Spanish, and so I'm trying to pick up some Spanish now. But it's a completely different attitude I have. Back then it was Spanish because you had to take Spanish. Everyone needed, why? Because you need 3 years of a foreign language. Think about it. Every American goes through 3 years of foreign language learning in a high school. We're the most monolingual country on earth. So this idea that you just pour teaching into children and they learn is nonsense, you know. It works for those who want to learn that way, you know, and some of us So, and those who do well in school, it's a feedback loop. So they get rewarded, they get the accolades, the grades, the honors. And yeah, of course they like school. But we also know that, you know, a fair amount of people don't do well in school.
I think it probably makes good sense to talk a little bit about the vocabulary, in the homeschooling dictionary. Yeah, there's schooling, there's education, there's learning.
Right.
I think in our daily use, we often conflate them. We sort of think of them similarly. Other people in the homeschooling, unschooling community in particular, think of them as very distinct and different.
Right.
So can you give us a sense as to how schooling, education, and learning are separate?
So I first encountered this phrase when I started work for him. Schooling is not the same as education. And, you know, you would often cite, like, you know, people who were either self-educated or who learned a lot. Like, so many people major in one area in college and graduate and work somewhere else. You know, doctors suddenly decide to stop being doctors and become carpenters, you know, and so on, you know. And, I mean, these things do happen, you know. And so schooling is not the same as education. Yeah, and that really stuck with me, you know. And I remember, you know, thinking about that, like, just because in my own experience, you know, in school, it's just like I saw that there were some kids that were incredibly smart in areas like sports, you know, but they couldn't do math. But as a result, they were knocked down in school. But, you know, they could talk about, you know, the tactics and strategy of a basketball game like a pro, you know. But that's not acknowledged.
So schooling is that which happens specifically within four walls or that institution.
Exactly. It's the transcript that follows you.
And the education may in fact happen in that place.
Right.
And it may just as well happen in the world that you're let loose into at 2:30.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. Now, when John was writing, and many other people since him, he referred to self-directed learning. You know, in recent years, I've been working with a group of people, and we started a group called AlternativesToSchool.com. As we're trying to come up, you know, it's a group of people, Dr. Peter Gray and some others who are like coming at it from the alternative school model of the Sudbury Valley and some others, some learning centers, and I'm bringing the unschooling, homeschooling perspective to it. And we're trying to figure out, like, the bigger issue to try and get this out. And we kept saying self-directed learning, but then Carlo Ricci he's a Canadian professor of education, and Peter started to discuss the idea, maybe we should start to talk about self-directed education, not self-directed learning. Because it still makes it sound like learning is just something that you do, like, oh, like I do magic, I learned that outside of school. You know, and that's okay, and that's why we could get away with this. But self-directed education means I'm taking control of my education. You know, and that's a bigger picture. And that's what we're trying to get at, is like, because we know our learning doesn't stop after we graduate college. And our learning didn't begin when we started school. You know, I mean, learning is from birth until death. You know, but hopefully. You wouldn't, but hopefully, but you wouldn't get that from the way schools talk.
Well, let's take a break there, Pat.
Okay.
And invite viewers to join us after this public service announcement.
It's Susan Karp, the Executive Director of the Arlington Council on Aging and the host for Living Out Loud. Don't be left behind. Keep moving. Give us a call for your transportation needs. We have a Council on Aging van as well as a dial-a-ride taxi service. So think about it. Are you going to wait for someone to pick you up, or are you going to pick up the phone and give us a call? 781-316-3400, Council on Aging Transportation Services.
Welcome back to Wide Angle. I'm Peter Bermudez, talking with Pat Farenga about homeschooling, home learning, unschooling, the whole gamut. And actually, maybe that brings us to a good place to start the second part with, and that is, I gather that the homeschooling community is some 2 million people across the country nowadays. However, it's not some sort of homogeneous, monolithic structure. It's a number of different groups. I think, as I gather, it breaks down into 3 primary groups, and it's families that are homeschooling for religious reasons, families, the schoolers at home, and then this group of unschoolers that you primarily work with, yeah? And that's really where I'd like to sort of dig a little deeper, because out of no disrespect, of course, for the first two groups, absolutely people should be able to follow that path that resonates most for their family and their children. But as I gather, the families that homeschool for religious reasons and the schoolers at home, they both accept and really sort of embrace the school idea, yes? And it's the unschoolers over here that stand distinctly insofar as they're trying to sort of renegotiate that idea and establish for their own families what learning looks like, where it takes place, how their lives look. Yeah. So I was wondering if you could sort of maybe paint for viewers a picture of sort of a day in the life of
people who are doing school at home, whether for religious reasons or just because they think they could do school better at home. They typically follow a curriculum, which they purchase, either from their religious entity or from, there's many schools, in fact, there are programs like Brigham Young University and stuff that offer high school curriculums, based on their college curriculum going down. So, that's all available. But as you said, there's this other group called, that John Holt termed unschoolers. Although he initially meant that for everybody, And, he just thought it was a better word than homeschooling because it indicates schooling that doesn't look like school, resembles school, and doesn't have to take place at home.
Right.
Because that's I think a big problem with the word homeschooling. It's like the parents are the teachers,
Right.
And I know again, like it could work for some families, and it does. Other families don't like that top-down authoritarian hierarchy. It's just like we have more experience with the parents, but we also want to involve you in our lives more. We don't want to follow. We feel like we don't need the curriculum guidelines. We're just going to see what your interests are and work with that.
Sure.
Which is actually what you do with the child from the minute they're born. You can read as many books as you want about childcare, but your child is going to teach you what foods they like. How quickly they're going to learn to walk and talk and so on. They're just guidelines. But it seems that with education, we just get this idea that even though there are all these varieties of education, Montessori and Waldorf and Sudbury Valley. Everyone has a different take on it, including the public schools. The public school curriculum has changed. Common Core has changed drastically. We have Back to Basics when I was working at Holt Associates in the early '80s under Ronald Reagan. One of the schools have always been in crisis and have always been like constantly being renegotiated, but no one seems to want to acknowledge that, but the thing is when you homeschool, you suddenly realize this because, oh my gosh, I could choose a Montessori curriculum, I could do, or you could be an unschooler or what they call some people call it eclectic homeschooling too, where they say, I'm going to pick and choose, but I guess the difference is that, in unschooling, you're letting the child do the picking and choosing as much as you are. Like you might have some final say on it or something, but you're pretty much leaving the decision to them.
So let's say you have a child who is really jazzed by medieval history, likes trebuchets and so forth. I remember building one.
Yeah.
What could a day? What might a day look like for an unschooling family who is following their child's interest in medieval history?
Right. I'm thinking of exactly of a family that I know in Cambridge. And their boys were in fact, this is something I don't know if you've noticed this, Peter, but about 10 years ago, it's like blacksmithing and swords were really big in the homeschooling community. And so these boys wanted to learn sword fighting. They wanted to learn how to make swords.
Sure.
So we found that there's a blacksmith in Waltham. And we introduced them to the blacksmithing guy. And they started to forge first little hooks and stuff, but then they eventually build up to their sword, right? Yeah. Another thing that the parents, and that, again, structured activity in the sense that they arrive at a certain time, they meet, there's discipline and all this stuff, but it's, not every day at 7 a.m. or 9:15 or whatever the clock says, you got to do now. It's like, no, we're choosing to be up and go out to meet this blacksmith at such and such a time one day, 2 days, whatever number of days a week.
Right.
You know, so that's that particular study. And then another thing that they got involved in was Higgins Armory.
Oh,
You know,
sure.
down in Worcester, and that's like I mean, there are so many. We are so lucky to live in like big cities that have these resources. You know, because you know you can go to Higgins Armory, and they actually have jousting and sword fighting competitions there. You could see that stuff. You could see all the armor. It's fascinating. But then you can also go to the MFA. You know, which has, I mean, it's not going to have the armor and that stuff, but they're going to have a lot of medieval art, that, you know, and there are classes being offered during, I mean, as homeschooling has grown, there have been more classes offered by institutions like the MFA that didn't have any school kids coming in except a certain, you know, well-planned, you know, events during the year, specific school events. Now all of a sudden, like they're offering homeschool classes, you know, throughout the whole year. And you know, and then of course there are Renaissance fairs and all these other activities that you know would get children into the Middle Ages. You know. So that's how they would, and of course then there are books and materials and so that's how like a middle school unschooling family would probably get into these sorts of things. You know, I think unschoolers that are doing you know that have younger children aren't going to be so focused on like doing specific things all the time as much as it is playing. You know, we're going to set up play dates. You know, we're going to have so-and-so come over to our house, you know. And as you know, as homeschoolers, you know, I mean, again, the socialization thing, schools have a monopoly on kids during the day. So we have to, you know, we have to find this time, and we have to make the time. We have to do the drive. I mean, there's a lot of parental responsibility, but not towards earning your teaching credential. It's towards your duties and responsibilities to your children and your fellow homeschoolers to create a community.
In the U.S., homeschooling is left and is responsibility of the states. It's not a federal issue. Sort of what in Massachusetts? What are the ins and the outs, and how would interested parents go about initiating a contact with a school district and saying I'm going to homeschool my child and sort of that process? How does that work?
Well, the first thing I'd recommend is to contact a homeschooler in your area. They're the ones that know the local people the most, and that's who you have to send your application. It's not an application, it's called a letter of intent. And this is the process, and in Massachusetts, it varies from state to state, but in Massachusetts, when you decide to homeschool your child, and that includes unschooling or Montessori, whatever method you're going to use. It's called homeschooling. You know? So you say, send a letter of intent to the superintendent of your local school district saying that you intend to homeschool your child, give their name and date of their ages or birth date, and then you've got to supply a general outline of what you're going to do. It doesn't have to be incredible detail. If you've purchased a curriculum, that's probably what you would note it there. Submit that. If you're going to unschool, you would say that you're going to take classes and such, follow these interests, and then and leave it open ended, because I mean that's the nature of it. And this would be like if you sent your kid to an alternative school. I mean, this is not unheard of in education. And then you have to agree on an evaluation. We don't have to agree, but you have to state what you want, how you're going to evaluate it. Because look, if you're going to do a curriculum at home, it makes sense to take the test that's assigned to that curriculum. And usually most books have it at the end, or you have to, you get it sent to you by the corresponding school or whatever, and you take it. If you're unschooling, you could use the portfolio method, where you save work samples, or just a written narrative. Because some people do a little bit of both. That's what we did. But the written narrative worked fine. We had 3 daughters who were homeschooled in Medford, and that's all we used. We did keep work samples. We were never asked for any.
Given your experience, in terms of resources, people, if people are interested in learning more, in terms of websites, books, organizations, what are those places that you would start people looking towards to find out more?
Some really good resources for Massachusetts homeschoolers would be ahem.info. That's Advocates for Home Education in Massachusetts. It's a statewide group that was been active, I don't know, at least 15 years, maybe more, been around a while. The Massachusetts Home Learners Association, MHLA.org, they've been around since the mid-'80s. They got started, they're like the first secular homeschooling group in Massachusetts. If you're into religious homeschooling, there's Mass Hope, which is the Christian group, state group. And then there's my website, johnholtgws.com. There's also startingtohomeschool.com that I operate. And if you're interested in homeschooling, but you're not sure, I would check out alternativestoschool.com, because that has, lets you realize that there's a lot of other types of schools out there and a lot of other ways of doing this than just sit down, read a book, and take a test.
Right. And there's also, I will say, specific to Arlington and surrounding communities, homeschoolingtogether.org, which is a group of homeschoolers. It's just, where's the park day? And where's the, go to the Robins for board games on Wednesday.
And I would emphasize that those local groups are the most important, because all the groups that I had mentioned were like statewide or regional.
Sure.
It really is the local groups where the action is.
Right. And who you'll be interfacing with.
Yeah, I mean, that's your kid's friend.
Certainly my sense, we could continue talking, but let's wrap it up here, and I'll ask you if there's anything that we haven't spoken of today that you feel it would be important to leave viewers with in terms of their thinking about homeschooling, unschooling, learning.
Well, I do feel that very strongly that we've overemphasized education to the point that it's become an incredibly stressful experience for parents, for children, incredibly expensive, and it's fraught. And this is ironic because we're born learning. There's evidence that children recognize voices and learn in the womb. I mean, even people in comas can hear things apparently. So this idea that your kids are somehow deficient because they're not up to grade level or so. I mean, look, if there's not a physical issue, don't sacrifice your relationship with your children on the altar of education. I've seen this too many times with school parents, and I've even seen it with homeschool parents. Your relationship with your children is more important than any school degree. And it's going to last longer. It's more important in the long run. So, I would say, I wouldn't make going to school or not going to school be the make or break issue in my family. Keep the door swinging, and keep the relationship alive. That's the most important thing. That's how learning happens. It's through relationships. But if you're not able to talk and communicate freely, the relationship shrinks, and so does learning.
Well, Pat, I thank you certainly for the time today, as well as for your decades of work in the unschooling community.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. We humans are, by our very nature, a curious bunch, which makes the job for those of us in our children's lives relatively straightforward when helping them learn. Assist them as they seek answers to their own questions, and expose them to new ideas, ever widening their experiences and, likely, their curiosities. For some, this might well be accomplished, at least in part, in our schools. Others may benefit from different opportunities, experiences, and relationships. Hopefully, we can do the difficult work of seeing our children as individuals, and, with some flexibility, foster environments that best promote their learning and growth, and, regardless of the path, grow along with them. For Pat Farenga, I'm Peter Bermudez. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Wide Angle.